My name is Sekani Solomon. I'm a designer, animator at Imaginary Forces, originally from Trinidad and Tobago, so shout out to anyone that's watching from home. And boy, oh boy, do we have some cool stuff to look at today. I'm pretty excited. But before I jump into my presentation, I'm going to play my new reel for you guys so you get an idea of the type of work that I do. Thank you so much, guys. So this Siggraph, I was just wondering, what am I going to present? So I was like, it would be pretty cool to make a project specifically for Siggraph. That's exactly what I did. But before I jump into the project, let me just play it for you guys. All right. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's character animation. There is textual animation. There's particles growing. There's fire. There's, a bunch of stuff. So what we're going to be doing today is kind of talking through this entire process from initial design all the way to compositing. Let's talk about the entire process. How do you approach something like this? All right, so let me pop open to my little PDF here. And it all starts with a design. Design is like your roadmap. Design is your plan. You should always start with the design. So I had this style frame lying around, and I was thinking, okay, what am I making? And I was like, wow, wouldn't it be so cool if I could make this into an animation? That's exactly what I did. But before I entered that process, I needed for myself to know what were the things that I wanted in this animation. And I kind of listed things out. What did I want to do? I wanted a dynamic camera animation. That was like one of the top things on my list. I wanted a dynamic texture animation because I wanted it to feel like he was going from one state to the next, and I wanted it to feel very powerful. Then I wanted some like growing particles or growing crystals. And then if you go back to the style frame, you see like there's some butterflies here, and I just wanted to find a way to also grow these guys on. And yeah, some sick energy. This guy's, for anyone who's grown up with Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, this is kind of like a throwback to all those things. And of course, particles. Who doesn't like particles, right? And that's what I had in mind going into animation. First thing first, camera. Let me just jump into cinema. Let's talk about camera animation. So whenever I do stuff, people always ask me, how do you animate the camera? And I'll tell you specifically what I did for this. So I'm just going to browse through and hit play here. Probably just set this too low. Oh, it's really slow. You know what? Let's just bring up that video. Quick time. Let's kind of browse through this for a bit, right? So it's pretty dynamic. We start from far, then we're rotating. We're coming really close to the guy. We're taking a close look at all this action that's going on. And then, we zoom back out to see all this stuff going on. And initially I was wondering, how do I approach this? So this is what I did. I kind of broke my camera down into two sections. So what I have first and foremost is a null object. And what this allows me to do is control my focal point and my rotation. So if I rotate this null, this camera rotates around it. And what that does, if I jump back into my camera and I just animate this rotation parameters, this automatically gives me really dynamic camera animation while still being able to determine where my focal point is. And if I wanted to change my focal point, I just move my null. And it's a really, really good way to animate cameras because what it does is that it gives you flexibility to change things. So my camera is controlling, all my this null object is controlling all the rotation. And then this camera is actually just dollying in and dollying out. So if I play this through, let's zoom out here a little bit. You see that the camera is just dollying in, and all this rotation that you see it coming around is being done by this null object. Right? And that's basically camera animation. And of course, I tried several different things before I came to this. I tried moving things on a spline. I tried all kinds of ways, just animating the camera by itself. That wasn't really successful. So that is camera animation. Now, animated textures. This is the part that I really scratched my head about trying to figure this out. Was it vertex maps? Was it going to be animated textures? How am I going to do this? And I'm going to show you the answer right now. This is the answer in a nutshell of how I kind of done the animated textures. And I'm going to tell you exactly what this means, right? So what you're looking at here is a procedurally generated noise texture that was built right inside of Cinema. When I'm using this black and white image to, and if I jump back to the, so I'm using this black and white image, right, to transition between these two textures. And I'm going to show you exactly how I'm doing this, but I want you to get it theoretically first. So say, for instance, this would be the black sections of that texture, and these would be the white sections of that texture. And I'm going to show you exactly how I built this and how I applied it to get this dynamic animation. So let's jump into Cinema for a second here. All right. So this is our dynamically created texture in Cinema. Let me just bump this up so you see it's a little bit clearer here. And how we created this, just play so we could take a look at it again. How we created this, I made a luminance channel, and I'm going to have to dive way in and then kind of build it back up. So this is our basic noise material, nothing fancy, none of these. We just have a standard noise material. And actually, let me just jump back for 2 seconds. Make sure I'm in the right one. Nope. Should be this one. Okay, I was in the right one. Perfect. All right. So this is a basic noise pattern, okay? And what I'm doing is I'm animating the brightness over time. And what that does, that grows that noise from black to white. But by default, and let me just go back and turn some of this extra stuff off, right? So by default, the edges aren't really clean. I mean, the edges are pretty clean, right? And what we want them to feel really organic. And what I did to do that, I went back and I created a distorter. And what this distorter does is that it uses another noise pattern to break up that other noise pattern that we created initially. And what that did is that it gave me a more robust edge. Like, see, right now it just looks really natural. And then when you add this distorter, what it does is that it distorts the edges so it looks a little bit more like this guy. This guy. There we go. You see, you have a more natural edge. So what I also did to give it more detail, because this wasn't enough, I wanted a little bit more detail on this noise pattern. I did a second layer using the same technique right? But what I did, I just made this initial noise texture a little bit smaller. So then you would get smaller pockets of noise in between that. So now I had this procedurally dynamically created noise texture that I could then render out as a PNG sequence. And that's exactly what I did. And this was the result. This guy. So now let's talk about application, right? How do you actually apply this to your model so it works and it looks kind of cool? That's not what I wanted to open. Yeah, let's jump into some Octane. High five for Octane. So I rendered this with Octane. Nice fun fact. And let's just bring up our live viewer here. See if we could squish it. Boom. Okay, cool. All right, let's just wait a couple seconds until this loads up. Right, so we get a nice preview. So what we have here, right, we have two skin materials which I've mixed into one. So just come back here. This is our mix one. This is just simply our skin by itself. And let's just let Octane do its thing. Updating. Right, so I was like, okay, so how am I going to mesh the two? Well, Octane gives you the ability to create something called a mix texture, right? And this is this mix texture. If I could bring it up. Again, Octane is doing its thing. I'll just hit pause for a second. Mix two. So what Octane allows you to do is take two materials, right? So I had this skin material, and I also created this kind of molten rock material, which was this guy. Just hit reset so we could take a look at that. Just let Octane do its thing, its thinking. Oh boy, that is not correct. It seems like we might have a missing texture somewhere. Let's just quickly reconnect that. Oh, actually, no, forget it. It's not really important to the point here. So, right, this is our second texture, right, more or less. So what we want to do now is just mix this in a way using that noise pattern. So now if I drag in my mix 2, it's just going to drag this in here. Let Octane do its thing. All right, so what we have here is that we're seeing these two textures being mixed. But the cool thing about an Octane mix material is that it allows you to bring in a texture to mix between these two materials. So more or less using that noise texture, it's telling Octane, okay, wherever, let me just shift this to the side. It gets a little choppy when Octane's running. Wherever it's white, reveal the skin. Wherever it's black, reveal this other molten texture. And as the camera is panning around this thing, that texture is animating and revealing thing as time goes on. So that was step 1. So I'm doing this, I was like, okay, that's kind of cool, but I really want these nice illuminated edges because that looks pretty sick. So I was like, I was busting my brain, how do I do this? Because I already use a mixed material. And then it was so silly, the answer was so obvious. So let's bring up Finder. And what I actually ended up doing, I took our same noise texture and this one. I went into After Effects and I duplicated it and shifted it slightly on the timeline, and I used a different matte. And what that, right? And what that did is that when it writes on, the same texture comes and erases it over time. And this was the end result, right? It writes on, then another texture comes right behind it and erases it on. I was like, wow, that's a pretty simple solution. So I did that, and then I made another mixed material starring this texture, which is kind of like our illuminated, fiery, kind of molten lava energy texture. And then I created a mixed material, and I'll bring that one up here. Octane is, what you call a resource hog. It just slows down everything. So yeah, I mixed our other mixed material, and then I took this new energy material, and then I used our new black and white matte. And I have a nice chart at the end to summarize everything, so it all makes sense. So I used another mixed material using a new rendered noise to add that extra piece of energy at the end. And if I just let Octane do its thing, this mix 3. Just make sure we have the right texture in here, and also make sure, I think Octane is still thinking. Still thinking. All right, there have been some weird texture disconnections between using Mac and PC. Forgive me. Error loading texture. I don't know why, because the texture is still being there, but I'll quickly reconnect this. Should be texture noise v4. All right. Let's click on one of these, open that up. All right. Now when we hit this, let's make sure animation is set. Resim that, and there we go. So now we have our solution, right? And when we play it back, we get a nice animated texture. I'm sorry, this isn't the fastest machine, so we don't get as nice of a real-time preview as I would like, but this is more or less the thinking behind it. Cool. All right, let me jump back into my... Let me just pause this because, again, Octane's such a render hog. All right, cool. Back into this. So I have this nice little chart that summarizes everything. So this is our 2 skin materials that we put in a mixed material. And then we mixed the 2 mixed materials using our very first black and white matte. And that got us from our skin to our molten. And then we took this material and mixed it with a very fiery material with our second matte that we created that got us our main material. And let me show you how that looked like straight out of the render. Look like that, right? Not that impressive. And this is one thing about my process too. You have to know where you could take this in compositing, right? And because I had the ability of making that matte, which to me was incredibly powerful, I actually rendered out a matte with just those edges. Now, how cool is that? Which gives me the opportunity to make these things really light and really pop in comp. So that's what you have to also think about. How can I do this in comp? Don't try to do everything in CG. That's just kind of stressing yourself out. And that was more or less generally how I did those textures. Just simply using black and white mattes to mix different materials and bring them all together. So, crystal growth. This is one of my favorite parts because you wouldn't believe this. Let me just jump in. And let's just take a look at this guy again. Jump back to our video. See if you look here, right? As the camera is coming around, you could see that these crystals are kind of growing onto his chest. And like, if I pause it right here, you could also see that these crystals are kind of flaking off, you know, as time proceeds. Now, what if I told you that this section here was done with 2 keyframes? Let's see how that's possible. On one word, it's called Siggraph. All right, let's get rid of this. No more octane. So this is our animation here, right? This is all procedurally built just using MoGraph effectors, and that's the power. That is a testament to the power of Cinema 4D. You could kind of go in and create these amazing rigs just using MoGraph effectors and kind of save yourself a lot of time. So let's actually go ahead and discuss what's really going on here. So there's a little bit of trickery, right? This might look like one solid object, but there's two crystals. So there's a solid one, and there's also a crystal that I shattered into a bunch of different pieces using a plugin called Explode. And the reason I did that was because, if I just use this crystal that only had all these broken up pieces, when you actually render it, you get a lot of flickering. It doesn't look nice. So at the end of the process, you want a really nice mesh to work with. So let's actually talk about this thing and kind of rebuild it. All right. All right, time to pull the curtains back on this. So as you can see, this is made from a bunch of different MoGraph effectors. And let's just tackle this one by one, piece by piece. So I'm going to turn off our solid crystal object, right? And let's just work with the pieces. I'm going to turn off all these MoGraph parameters. So the first thing I did, first thing you actually have to do is really think about how you want these things to move. And when you could define how you want each of these things to move, it's easier to then jump into animation and kind of figure it out. So I know I wanted these crystals. If I jump back to the animation. Where did it go? I need to remember not to close it. If you go back to the animation, you would see that these crystals kind of like, they come out from nowhere, and they grow and they kind of fall onto its chest and then grow outwards. And because I've kind of divided the labor into these different things, into these different aspects, I could tackle it one by one. So step one, I wanted these crystals to grow downwards, just like so. And how I did that, I made sure I had all my pieces in a fracture object. And a fracture object is important because it allows MoGraph to talk to each one of the pieces inside that fracture object. All right, so we had this fracture object, and I made a plane effector. And now I could use this plane effector, if I go into my parameters, to move each one of these objects just by simply dragging these parameters. And for anyone who's used the plane effector, you would know that the plane effector is used to just move clones, so move things in a particular direction. But then there's other really important aspect I want to talk about, and it's called weighting, because you don't want each one of these things to move at the same time. So what I did, I used a random effector, and I added weight to each one of these clones. And just so you know what I mean, I'll actually just demonstrate that. So let's say we had a sphere, and then MoGraph. We duplicated this, we made a grid. Let's spread this out, right? And I'm going to use that same plane effector, and I'm going to, let's make sure it's on objects. And I want to try to move these in like a natural way. See, the problem is it's all moving at the same time, and we don't want that. And that's why weighting is so important. And just to recap, what random weights is doing is just telling each one of these clones to be affected by whatever effector in a different way. So I'm going to make a random effector, MoGraph effector random. I'm going to turn off position, and I'm going to slide a weight transform right up. And let's go back to a clone. I'll go to transform. I'm going to initiate weight. So if I turn this off, you'll see that they're all red. That means each effector, what that means is the effector is affecting each thing at the same rate, with the same amount of power. But with a random weight applied to it, What this now means, and you can see the different colors, is that this plane effector is going to affect each one of these with different strength. So now, if I take my same plane effector, and then you have to make sure that this random weight, and let's make sure and name this guy so we don't get confused. We have to make sure that this weight is on top in our hierarchy. So now, when I move this, it feels more organic. It's not all moving at the same time, right? And that's what we want. We want something that feels a little more organic when we move objects. And that's what I did. That's what I did for this. So now what I have done, I made sure I nested all the different ones, all the different effectors I was using under this twister. So then once I drag one, everything else will affect this, this group. So I'm going to walk through everything else and just show you how lovely this system is, because you could just stack and stack different effects and you could just make something really cool. So step number one, right? I use the plane effector to move things. Thing number two, I didn't want it to be so large. I wanted it to appear from thin air. So what I did, I create this scale. And what that does, and I forgot to mention that each one of these plane effectors are using fall off. And what fall off allows you to do is affect these clones in 3D space, which means if I drag it and it's within this vicinity, it's going to affect it. Right? So this scale is making these disappear. And let's also just talk about fall off for a second. This scale fall off means that everything at this point will be shrunk, and everything over here will not be shrunk. So when I turn this on, as we can see, everything here is shrinking, everything here is coming back to its normal state. I'm just dragging this through, and you can see, all right, that's looking good. Cool. So the other thing I wanted to do, I wanted to get rid of all the pieces once it's kind of grown on and stuck to the surface. So that's when I turned on this eraser. And this is another plane effector that just has a -1 scale on it. Super simple stuff. So now I'm just dragging with this one thing, and I'm having all this animation take place. So that's more or less how we're doing the pieces. So the other problem was, okay, so now that I have this growing on, how am I getting the solid crystal back? Solution is this little guy called Poly Effects. Now, for you guys who haven't used Poly Effects before, what this essentially is a MoGraph effector that allows MoGraph to communicate with the polygons of any object. So now I'm taking a plane effector and communicating with the individual polygons of this object. So I have my poly effects enabled with my solid grower, which is this guy here. And if I turn him on, you would see that I'm using him to shrink everything at this point and grow everything over on that point. And again, you know, if I move my twister, it's just going to be growing. I can zoom in so you get a closer look. It's just going to be growing. And let's put on garage shading. It's just going to be growing all these polygons as I drag it up. And now, when you turn on everything, you have this somewhat complex-looking animation that's built with MoGraph effectors and fall-off, but feels, you know, like potentially something that you might make in Houdini, but really simple, really easy to do. And then when you apply it to this, it looks good. And you know, I just kind of reversed it to get this nice breaking up on the top here, just like this stuff as well, this stuff as well. I just had it set it going back down and reversing it to get that process. So again, you know, my philosophy in Cinema 4D is try to work smart and create, you know, these type of setups and use less keyframes and make your life easier, because this is the coolest part, right? If I was like, I wanted to make this move up instead, I could just jump back into this mover and change that parameter, right? So now, when I move this, it's just going to move up instead. Super flexible, really nice way of working. I advise, you know, MoGraph is definitely the way. So Ooh, that does not cover crystal growth. There is another part to... There's another part to this. So as this animation is taking place, we're seeing these crystals grow on with that dynamic texture animation, right? And you're probably wondering, how are we doing this? One answer. We're actually using that very same texture that we created, and we're inputting it using a shader effector. So what we have here is a cloner that's cloning. Let's turn off the shader for a second. Let's jump out the camera. All right. So yeah, what we have right now is just a cloner that's cloning these crystals onto his body. And then we can apply a shader effector to this cloner that tells that cloner when and where to grow these crystals. So what that means, more or less, using that same black and white texture, wherever it appears white, it's going to start scaling stuff up, because right now in our shader effector, we've set things to be scaled. So as we scroll through, that texture is dictating where, things are growing, more or less. So again, it's kind of using things that you already have to apply to this. Okay, so that is crystal growth. Ooh, butterflies. That was an interesting little aspect of this project. I can't believe how many times I've actually closed this video and reopened it. So yeah, another part was these cute kind of little butterflies flying out from this guy's chest, which in theory seems kind of weird, but if you powered up and you saw butterflies came out, that might be kind of cool. Little secret, 0 keyframes on these butterflies. All procedurally animated. And let's just kind of see how we did that. Butterflies. So these are our butterflies being generated. And what we're doing is we're using X particles. And we're using an X particle generator to clone this butterfly onto each particle. But we're making sure to set it up so that these cloned butterflies would take the direction and the tangent from each one of these particles that feels very natural. So I'm setting up a emitter that has turbulence on it, so then our particles move in a very, organic way once they kind of fly out. And I'm just dictating via the emitter, what frame it should be emitted on. But that really doesn't explain how our butterflies are moving without any keyframe animation. So, this is what I love to do. Just kind of figure out how to do this with no animation. Vibrate tag. Simple solution. Just setting what angle I want and making sure to set the second one at the inverse of that angle, so they move in opposite directions while they flap. And so, I just took this fruit in a generator, generated some particles, and that worked really well. When I initially did it, I was trying some similar MoGraph techniques, but it just didn't work as well as I wanted it to. So after trying this technique, I was pleasantly surprised at how well that it works. So, all right, I'm really figuring out this animation. This project's coming along. Let's render this bad boy. All butterflies. We got our pretty butterflies done. Compositing. How am I going to make this thing look cool? If you guys remember that initial render that I showed you, I mean, it looked good, but it wasn't like amazing, right? This is our beauty pass, just straight up beauty pass. Let's play it from the top. You could tell it needed a lot of work. And this is just my philosophy in 3D in general. Gets it to as far as it needs to be in 3D to the rest in comp, because you'll be saving yourself a lot of headache. And I'm just going to kind of break down how I went about doing that. So these days, I use Nuke to composite everything I have, all my 3D. This is kind of like my Nuke script. Nothing makes me blush more than a lovely Nuke tree that's all nice and tidy. So I just wanted to show that. But most importantly, it's kind of having a clear idea of the direction that you want to go in. So this was my beauty pass initially, and I just kind of built it up in stages. Stage one, I just want to get some more atmosphere in there. So, I didn't want anything that had too much information, so I wanted to use large areas of color, and that's really blurred out. Going down, I wanted to touch up these parts, these crystals. Some more glows and atmosphere to really bring them and make them feel alive. Some more atmospheric lighting on the top, so it feels a little bit diffuse. Then I made some kind of energy type thing and using like this Plexus plugin and in Cinema, and just kind of brought that in as a pass. Then I did a Turbulence FD sim that I kind of color graded and placed on top of this guy. Then I did a particle sim, in particular in Cinema and After Effects, and just a pro tip when using particular: if you want your particles to look really good, make sure you have depth of field on your camera and make sure motion blur is on, because the difference between having a particles with particle with motion blur and without, huge. Then I added some rocks, extra rocks in Nuke that's just projected on planes. Depth of field, that's bringing the sexy. Difference between that and that. Depth of field. Then we're talking about adjustment layers. I put a nice little blue color grade to bring everything together with the depth of field. Then, this is where the real sexy comes in. Some RGB, some chromatic aberration on the edges, making sure you have some vignetting, some nice little grain, some glows on top. Those are the layers. It's those 4 or 5 layers that really kind of glues your comp together. And this is more or less the final image. But, the jump from like here to here with just those final images, these final layers, paramount. That's some more cool stuff, right? This is what Turbulence FD pass. Doesn't look impressive at all. That's where compositing comes in. You take that, use a curves adjustment, you bring it back down, you grade it blue. Looks really cool. This is what particles pass. Again, just kind of bringing my camera into After Effects and making this with some motion blur. This is another pass that I did up here. I think there's some other flames. All right, and that's more or less the compositing that I did for this project. Time, and this was the end result, just kind of throwing everything together. Music helps. So, my name is Sekani Solomon. I'm a designer, animator at Imaginary Forces New York. If you guys want to see more of my work, you could hit me up at Sekani Motion Design. Also, vimeo.com/Sekani. Always hit me up on Instagram at Sekani Solomon. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.